Okay, good morning everyone. This week again we have a double Torah portion of Achreil Mot and Kedoshim. I'm going to focus on a very popular verse in the Parashat, the portion of Kedoshim. But before I do that, I would like to at this point express my thoughts and prayers which are with the people in Greater Boston who have suffered this week through a double bombing at the Boston Marathon. And right now there are neighborhoods in the city, including a neighborhood where I lived for many years, that is on lockdown. So we hope that God will protect them and the perpetrators will be brought to justice swiftly, and that they, along with us, should know no more pain, that God should continue to protect this great country of the United States. All right, the verse that I wanted to focus on today is probably one of the most popular verses in the entire Torah. We are told, "You will not take revenge, you will not hold a grudge against members of your people," and it ends, "You will love your neighbor or your fellow as yourself, I am God." Biblical commentator Rashi quotes an earlier sage, Rabbi Akiva, who knows that this verse, "You will love your neighbor as yourself," is a fundamental principle of the Torah. It's actually based upon a story in the Talmud, which we'll get to a bit later on. Before we get to that story, I want to talk about the comments made here by a younger contemporary of Rashi, contemporary that is, lived within the next 100 years or thereabouts, Ramban, Nachmanides, where he notes that this command of loving one's neighbor as oneself is clearly an overstatement, clearly an exaggeration, because, Nachmanides notes, a person is incapable of literally loving his neighbor as himself or herself. Moreover, there is a story in the Talmud, not relevant to what we just spoke about before with regards to Rashi and Rabbi Akiva's comment, but another story in the Talmud, or discussion in the Talmud, which notes the following. This is to be found for those of us who are interested and able to look it up. It's in Masechet Bava Metzia, Daf Samach Bet Amud Aleph. We are told that if two people are traveling in a desert or otherwise inhospitable area, and only one of them, an uninhabited area presumably, and only one of them has a canteen of water, if they both drink from this canteen, they will die. They will both die, since there is only enough water for one of them to survive. And if one of them drinks, of course, he will survive. So what happens? What should one do in a case like that? So Ben Petura, a rabbi, notes the following: "It is better that both of them should drink from the canteen and die, rather than have one of them experience the death of the other." Such was held to be the final decision, the halakha, Jewish law, until Rabbi Akiva, the same Rabbi Akiva we encountered before, came and interpreted another verse in the Torah discussing not taking interest on a loan, and that verse ends, "And you will fear your God and let your brother live with you." So he notes that since the Torah says that your brother will live with you, that teaches us that, as Rabbi Akiva notes, "Chayecha kodmein lechaye chavercha." Your life takes precedence over your fellow's life. In other words, your brother will live with you, in this verse, suggests that the duty to uphold the life of one's brother, of another human being, applies only when one's own life is not in danger. So Nachmanides notes from here that we see from here that one need not literally love one's neighbor as oneself, for if one were to do so, then Rabbi Akiva's decision here, his conclusion, really wouldn't make sense. Rather, Nachmanides notes that the Torah instructs us to love our fellow human being in all matters and desire good for one's fellow as one desires it for oneself. Therefore, one must praise and honor one's neighbor and be respectful of his or her property as one would be respectful of one's own possessions. Now, in the Hebrew, when we are told to love one's neighbor as oneself. It doesn't say, v'ahavta et re'acha, you should love the person of one's neighbor as oneself. Instead, the Torah says, v'ahavta lire'acha kamocha, you should literally love for your neighbor as yourself. And Nachmanides notes, perhaps the idea is not to love the person, but instead to benefit the person, to support the person, to support the fellow, and love as if it were advantageous for you. At times, Nachmanides notes, we are prepared to support and praise our fellow in certain areas, but not others. We may, for instance, not begrudge a fellow human being if he or she becomes well-to-do, whose bank account, rivals ours, but we not want that individual to be as wise as we are, or vice versa. Nachmanides notes that the Torah demands of us that we rid ourselves of this type of debasing jealousy, and instead we should do as much good for our fellows in all areas as we would want to do for ourselves. We may not, as Nachmanides concludes this part of discussion, place limitations on our love for others. A contemporary of Rashi and Nachmanides, Ramban Ibn Ezra, notes the same thing. Says the Torah instructs us to love our fellow in all areas and desire good for one's fellow as one desires it for oneself. Maimonides, not Nachmanides, but Maimonides, the Rambam, notes in his Code of Jewish Law, in Hilchot Deot, in chapter 6, Law 3, Halacha 3, that one must literally love every fellow Jew as one loves oneself, as it says, you will love your fellow as yourself. Therefore, one must speak praises of one's fellow and show concern for his or her financial situation, just as one would show concern for one's own finances and desire to be honored. One who seeks honor through the debasement of his fellow, Maimonides concludes, has no share in the hereafter. So Maimonides takes a very different approach. Maimonides understands this command of love thy neighbor as thyself as meaning literally one has to love one's neighbor as oneself, in contradistinction to Nachmanides, who says it is a bit of an exaggeration. Now we get to the story in the Talmud that I indicated towards the beginning, that is the basis for Rashi's comment, quoting Rabbi Akiva, that this command, this phrase, this verse, one should love one's neighbor as oneself, is a fundamental principle of the Torah. We have a story that involves a convert, or a potential convert. A convert, we are told in the Talmud, again this is in Masechet Shabbat, Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, a potential convert came to the Rabbi Shammai and said to him, convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. What I mean by that is subject to various interpretations, but Shammai considered this individual to be mocking Jewish law and tradition, which is obviously very complicated, and he pushed him away with the rule that he had in his hand. He didn't hurt him, but he just indicated to him, no, he's not, will not agree to convert this individual. This Gentile then approached the Rabbi Hillel, the great Rabbi Hillel, with the same request, and Hillel did convert him. Before converting him, Hillel said, okay, in answer to your question, this is what the entire Torah is based on. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. This is the entire Torah. All the rest is elaboration on this central theme. Now go and study the Torah. That's the end of the story in the Talmud. There are two different ways to interpret this story. One way is suggested by a great commentator known as the Maharsha. He notes that Hillel's comments, right, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow, is clearly based upon our verse, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself. However, Maharsha goes on and says, the question is, there is a fundamental difference between the way our Torah phrases the principle and the way this Rabbi Hillel phrased the principle. Our Torah phrases this idea, this principle in the positive. Love your neighbor as yourself. Whereas Hillel put it in the negative, right? Saying, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. Why did he do that? What was his rationale for doing so? Why did he change the wording of the verse? So this Rabbi Maharsha, this commentator, notes is perhaps due to the fact that this command, one should love one's neighbor as oneself, is preceded by two negative commands, right? Do not take revenge, do not hold a grudge. So Hillel probably imagined that just as these first two commands in this verse are put in the negative, similarly, this verse, love thy neighbor as thyself, is to be defined, is to be interpreted in terms of one what ought not do to others, rather than what one ought to do for one's neighbors. So according to Hillel, the very verse, one should love thy neighbor as thyself, seems to perhaps suggest Nachmanides' approach, which is the verse is not to be taken literally. You don't have to literally love the person of one's neighbor as oneself. One simply has to avoid doing anything hurtful or harmful to one's neighbor as one would want done for oneself. And again, that fits into Nachmanides' approach, not Maimonides' literal interpretation of loving the person of one's neighbor as oneself. There is, however, another interpretation of this story from the Talmud. Commentator, the work is known as Iyun Yaakov, and he suggests that Hillel phrased what he did in the negative for the simple reason that it would be easier for this potential convert to understand, to agree to, than to put it in the positive. In other words, he was suggesting a part of the law of loving one's neighbor as oneself, but not the full extent of that law. The full extent of that law, according to this commentator, is indeed what Maimonides claims, which is it is to be taken literally. However, this convert wasn't going to be given the full, complete interpretation of the verse, instead was told, well, an important milestone, an important way in understanding this verse, understanding the entire Torah, is not to harm or act in a way that is hateful to another human being. We have other approaches. We have another rabbi who was also someone who lived in the general timeline of Rashi and Nachmanides and Maimonides, that's the Rivah, who says that one should never do anything dishonorable or injurious to a neighbor, to one's fellow, just as one would not want it done to oneself. So we have, it seems, the consensus, at least in this brief survey that we've engaged in now, is that Nachmanides is the correct approach, in that one is not obligated to take this verse literally of loving one's neighbor literally as oneself. However, I should point out that one of my great rabbis, Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory, who founded Maimonides School in Boston, I was affiliated with for many years and was a professor of Talmud at Yeshiva University. He actually held that Maimonides' interpretation was the correct one, and that one is in fact obligated to love one's neighbor, the person of one's neighbor, of one's fellow, as one loves oneself. I wanted to conclude this discussion with an interesting comment in the Midrash, which is also a collection of Jewish rabbinic interpretation. There is another verse, in addition to this verse, love thy neighbor as thyself, there is also a verse in the book of Genesis, actually in the Parashat of Bereshit, of Genesis as well, where we are taught that this, that is the Torah, is the account of the descendants of Adam. Adam, of course, the first person. On the day of God's creation of man, man was created, or humanity was created in the likeness or the image of God. So, a commentary known as Da'at Zakenim Ba'alei HaTosafot, which is also a collection of interpretations that go back to the same time frame that we're dealing with these other commentators, first quotes what we started off our discussion with. Rabbi Akiva, and Rashi quoted him, as talking about one should love one's neighbor as oneself, and Rabbi Akiva comments as a significant principle in our Torah, again, based upon the story with Hillel that we just concluded discussing. However, the Medrash continues, another rabbi named Ben Azai, disagrees with Rabbi Akiva and says that this verse from Genesis, which discusses the fact that humanity was created in the image and the likeness of God, is an even greater principle. So this commentator, Da'at Sakanim, commentary explains, if one were to base one's attitude and one's actions on the verse quoted by Rabbi Akiva, again, our verse, one should love one's neighbor as oneself, one could only infer that what I find hateful I cannot do to my fellow. What about if the individual involved is someone who really is not so concerned about his or her own honor? What about if the individual involved doesn't really mind if people speak insultingly, disrespectfully to him or her? One might conclude that that individual has indeed license to act that way towards others. So Ben Azai comes along and says, no, one cannot do that. If you want to be in a certain sense humble, that's your business. However, you need to remember that every human being was created in the image of God, and therefore every human being deserves respect and dignity. We must recognize the likeness of God in his fellow human, even if she or she chooses not to recognize it in her or himself. As a matter of fact, one of the commentators on this approach in the Medrash, the sainted Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, who was a great rabbi who lived in pre-World War II Europe, he passed away in 1933, claims that by shaming one's fellow, one is, in effect, shaming the likeness of God himself. What we see from all these discussions is, even though there are different interpretations and different applications of these laws, of these rulings, of these concepts, what is certainly supremely important is for us to realize and for us to remember and incorporate it into our own daily lives, the importance that the Torah places on the way we act and the way we treat our fellow human beings. This is an important principle, no question about it, whether or not it's the most important principle, as Rabbi Akiva says, or Ben Azai says in conjunction with another principle. The idea is, of course, that the way we treat our fellow human beings makes a very, very big difference, not only in terms of the world we live in, but in terms of the type of people that we ourselves are and that we will hopefully become. Thank you all. Shabbat Shalom.